Good evening, and welcome to the Cabinets of Fever Dreams. Tonight, a tale of home, love, and infidelity. My Wife is Pregnant with Our Haunted Apartment is read to you tonight by Sam Barlien with musical backing by Petar Mrdjen. If you want to give the YouTube algorithm a nudge so it recommends this channel to more people, please like the video and comment baby. Also, if you'd like to hear these stories early and help keep a roof over my head, drop by patreon.com/MikeJLanger. All your support is greatly appreciated. With all that said, take a seat and stay away from the walls. They have a life of their own.
After my wife told me she was pregnant, our marriage returned to normal. For a couple months at least. The quivering wet splotches in our bedroom dried off and left not a trace of the horror they once inspired. The affection my wife showed towards the apartment descended, well, into normalcy. And all notions that I had about my wife being unfaithful to me with a ghost started to seem absurd. My mother was ecstatic when we Skyped her. Knowing that my brother has no interest in children, the burden of providing grandkids was solely on my shoulders. She even cried tears of joy when we told her the news. Even with memories of cement tentacles driving me to the ground still fresh in my mind, I couldn't bring myself to change the nature of her tears. When my wife shared the news on social media later in the day, both our phones exploded with congratulations. Old classmates, extended family, co-workers, even Jana called to wish us well. No amount of marital bliss could completely wipe the visions of madness protruding from the drywall, or the gut-wrenching sound of my wife moaning her dead lover's name. Any doubts I had about the paternity of the child, however, had to be buried to preserve my sanity. I was a happily married, gainfully employed, soon-to-be dad for a couple months, at least. By the time my wife started showing, I'd become an essential part of the team at work. She mentioned offhandedly that she had doctor's appointments coming up, but they were always situated in the middle of my workday. When I asked if she wanted me to accompany her, she waved off the offer. She could manage the doctor on her own. If I was needed at work, I was needed at work. The child did need to eat, after all. My wife didn't want to know our baby's gender, and I was content with the mystery. Whenever I asked her how the doctor's appointments went, she would just tell me that the baby was healthy. That was the most important question for me. And knowing that the baby was alright was enough to give me sound sleep. My mother, on the other hand, was filled with questions. The mystery of the child's gender perturbed her, since she didn't know what color to knit baby clothes in. She didn't like it. What my mother was unwilling to accept, what sent her into a rambling fury of me being a bad husband, was that I didn't accompany my wife to her doctor's appointments. It didn't matter that my wife didn't insist, my mother said. A real man wouldn't let his wife trudge through the healthcare system alone. In my own words, I brought up this argument to my wife while we were decorating the guest room. At first, she shrugged it off, claiming that I'm more needed at work than at her regular checkup. As I insisted I come with her for the next appointment, however, my wife admitted that she wasn't going to the local hospital as she'd told me. Apparently, she had a university friend that practiced prenatal care in a nearby village. She didn't tell me about her because she didn't want me to worry. "Oh, there's nothing wrong with our child," my wife said. She just preferred to visit someone she knew instead of a faceless doctor. The fact that my wife was getting her checkups from someone who wasn't officially certified bothered me. But what bothered me considerably more was that she didn't want me to visit this mysterious medical professional. Throughout our marriage, I have often chosen the path of least resistance, but on this particular issue, I put my foot down. I wanted to meet the doctor my wife was seeing for her prenatal care. It's with my insistence that I see the care my unborn child was receiving that our marriage started to crumble once more. The village in which my wife's friend lived was a solid hour and a half ride away. Prague's public transport system being significantly more efficient than a car neither of us had renewed our driver's license. We were driven to the village by another friend of my wife's. His car seemed like it came from the junkyard, and his clothes looked and smelled as if they were improvised in similar environs. The man did not speak for the whole ride. When I tried making small talk with him, my wife told me he didn't speak English. The village we arrived at was a grouping of a dozen or so houses, far off from any semblance of any urban civilization. Sheep dotted the valleys above, chickens roamed the makeshift roads, and frail pensioners peeked out from behind their curtains as we rode by. Most of the village seemed to be stuck in the previous century. The house in which my wife had her checkups seemed much more modern. However, it stood on a hill above the rest of the village, and outside of it sat a grouping of half a dozen folk similar to the drivers. They all had dreads, walked around barefoot, wore homemade clothing, and not a single one of them spoke English. After a couple months in the country, I had learned a handful of basic phrases to make my life less awkward. Whenever we would be shopping or dining or walking through Prague, I would do the majority of the talking, and my wife would stay silent. I presumed my wife might be learning some basic Czech, but I didn't think she knew more than me. The moment we got out of the car, however, my wife spoke fluently. She chatted and joked with the gathered hippies outside the house, and on occasion, she would point to me. The dreaded group outside of the house was more than happy to see her, but they ignored my presence altogether. There was no medical equipment in the examination room. In fact, the room was no different to any of the other rooms in the cottage. I'd expected some semblance of privacy, but the hippies that met us outside of the house observed the examination along with me. Throughout the entire affair, my wife remained completely clothed and only pulled up her shirt to reveal her belly. My wife's friend didn't do anything particularly medical either. She'd hover her hand above the belly and ask short questions to which my wife would reply. After about 15 minutes of this, back and forth, we were given a big thumbs up and sent back on our way. When we got home, I questioned my wife on her ability to speak Czech. She seemed surprised. Had she not told me that she spoke the language? Had I not noticed she would chat to her university friends in Czech back when we met at the rooftop bar? I was absolutely certain that my wife only spoke in English when we met her friends, and I was doubly certain that she had never mentioned that she spoke the language to me. As we argued, however, I started to feel less sure about my position. As with most of our arguments, I eventually let the subject slide. Even though we stopped arguing about my wife's bilingualism, however, the question stayed lodged in my head. With Jana's number in my phone from the pregnancy announcement, I decided to call and ask. She was just as surprised as I was. In the years she had known Jana, my wife never spoke more than a sentence to her in Czech. Even then, she did so in a thick accent that was meant to underscore just how little of the language she spoke. The mystery of my wife's sudden Czech skills was bothersome, but it quickly became just another detail in an incomprehensible existence. It started the night we came back from her checkup. My wife had been annoyed that I tagged along, and all questions about her sudden ability to speak Czech or the qualifications of her doctor friend amplified her displeasure. We went to bed angry that night. With the questions about my marriage roaring through my head and a big meeting at work waiting for me in the morning, I took a couple pills to help me fall asleep. I passed out not soon after. But my sleep that night was not calm. Through the medication and sleep, it all came in flashes, indistinguishable from dreams. I faintly recall the mattress creaking as my wife got in and out of bed. I faintly recall something soft and wet tracing the edges of my feet. I faintly recall the ceiling sagging as if it were flooded and about to burst. All that happened that night was blurred and dimmed and ungraspable. What I do recall perfectly well was the morning after. The blinds were pulled. My body was sore. There was a big wet splotch on one of the walls, and the longer I looked at it, the more it stretched. The curtains closed on the brief period of normalcy in my marriage. Over the coming days, my wife started to spend most of her time alone in the bedroom. Whenever she left the room, she would keep one hand caressing the walls, and by week's end, I caught her sneaking a lick. Whenever I tried bringing any of this strange behavior up, well, she'd simply laugh and call me crazy. Once, defiantly, she even started to passionately lick the wall just to show how insane my delusions were. She licked the wall long enough for me to have to leave the room. What made everything so much worse were the constant calls from my mother. She kept on begging for updates about her soon-to-be grandson and chastised me at any sign of poor husbandly behavior. Everything I told her was a complete work of fiction. She was far too happy to hear the truth, and in a way, I guess, with all the evidence plainly in sight, I refused to completely accept the truth myself. I didn't feel safe anywhere in the apartment. But the bedroom was the worst. The walls reeked of something horrid, and whenever I laid down to sleep, it felt as if they were about to collapse on me. When I brought this up to my wife, she suggested that I didn't need to sleep in our bedroom. The child wouldn't arrive for at least half a year, and the guest bedroom was free till then. Well, I refused. I said there's no way I'm going to leave my own bedroom. After 3 sleepless nights, however, I bought an extra mattress and spread it out on the guest room floor. It felt beyond humiliating to sleep on the floor of a room intended for an infant. What made that humiliation worse was my wife's nightly moaning next door. I lived like this for months. The days all blurred in together. And were it not for the alcoholic office culture at work, I would have ended up unemployed. I lived like this for months. And then, one night, out of the blue, I texted Jana. I craved to be skeptical, but by then I had no illusions about my wife having an affair with the ghost that haunts our apartment. As for the question of the paternity of the child, however, I never let my mind wander that far. That thought, it was too painful to consider. It wasn't until the morning that I met up with Jana that I vocalized the possibility. I told Jana my wife could be pregnant with the ghost that haunts our apartment. We had each drank 2 coffees by the time the words stumbled out of my mouth. She didn't laugh at me. She didn't call me crazy. Instead, she said that my theory was exactly what she was scared of when she'd first found out about her pregnancy. Jana didn't think my wife was capable of murdering me. Getting impregnated by a ghost, however, didn't seem entirely out of character. In as much detail as she could muster, Jana told me stories of the dark arts that my wife was interested in back in university. I'd heard some of the stories before as anecdotes my wife told me back when we were dating, yet the events that Jana had been witness to were considerably less innocent and bloodier. Had we drunk another coffee, both of our hearts would have exploded, so innocently, we switched over to wine. We spoke for hours, and by the time there were no stories to tell, we were both far too buzzed to make sense of the situation. Neither of us went home, though. Past the insanity of my situation, I could imagine Jana being someone I could be friends with in a more normal world. The feelings seemed mutual. There were no missed calls on my phone that day. When I came back home, it took my wife a full 30 minutes to emerge from the bedroom. Nothing had happened. The conversation was purely friendly, and my innocent day drinking session with a friend was nothing compared to the transgressions of my wife, and yet, in the slightest bit, I felt guilty. I felt as if I'd somehow been unfaithful. I didn't reach out to Jana, and Jana didn't reach out to me. Over the coming weeks, we became strangers once more. It wasn't until a month before the due date that I reached out to Jana again. For months, clear moans of pleasure, intermingled with the name I cannot pronounce, would haunt me through the night. As the due date approached, however, the moans stopped. They stopped and were replaced with giggles. My wife was laughing as if someone was tickling her. Well, she seldom left her bedroom before, but when the moans stopped, so did her excursions through the apartment. Fearing that something had happened to her, I peeked into that pungent cave, which was once my bedroom, and the bed was broken, but she didn't seem to mind. My wife lay, filthy and ragged, in the cratered mattress. The moment her eyes met mine, she insisted I leave the room immediately. When I asked her through the door whether she felt okay, she said she was fine. When I asked her through the door if she wanted something to eat, she said she didn't need to eat anymore. In the evening, her dreadlocked driver showed up. He briefly told her something, which she responded with a raucous laughter. Then, he approached me. He spoke quickly without a hint of eye contact. Even after months of studying the language, I couldn't understand a word he said. Finally, with utter contempt, he said in English, "Soon. Important. Be ready." He didn't stick around for an explanation. Jana was happy I reached out to her. She was free to meet the following evening. We met in the place where we got coffee months before. This time, we skipped the coffee and went straight to wine. Maybe it was the sheer horror of my circumstance. Maybe it was the fact that both of us had skipped lunch, and maybe we both harbored feelings which the wine loosened out of us. I woke up around 3 a.m. in Jana's apartment. Whatever misplaced feelings of affection that filled my chest hours prior were washed out in the rancid waters of a hangover. The feelings seemed mutual. Jana offered me the couch to sleep on, but we both agreed an Uber would be the better course of action. When I arrived home, my wife was completely uninterested in where I'd spent the night. She was too busy laughing. These weren't the light-hearted giggles I had heard through the wall. My wife was cackling, like someone who should be locked up in an asylum, and only broke from her psychotic joy to wheeze at me to leave the room. I was too exhausted to argue. But I was not tired enough to fall asleep. For hours, I laid on that cursed mattress and stared at the friendly cartoon hippos on the curtains. Tried to find some semblance of sleep. The laughter didn't cease. It simply grew louder and more frantic, and served as a constant reminder of the depravity my life had reached. It was just as the sun started above the sea of panel houses that I heard the front door of the apartment open. It had been locked. I was sure of that. Fearing a robber entering our home, I jumped off the mattress and prepared to face the intruder. It was the dreaded driver. He had a wheelchair in tow. I demanded to know how he got into our apartment, but he had no answers for me. Or perhaps he didn't understand my question, but even if he did, I doubt he would have answered. One look in his eyes made it clear he held nothing but contempt for me. The man with dreads pushed past me and disappeared into the bedroom. When he entered, my wife's laughter died down into hoarse whispers, and for a couple minutes, the two spoke in quiet voices as if there was someone around who could understand them. When the door opened again, the man had my wife in the wheelchair. My glimpses into the bedroom were always brief. On account of my wife's shouting and the curtains of the room had always been drawn, it wasn't until I saw the woman that I married in the warm sunlight pouring into the hallway that I could comprehend the full nature of her transformation. She didn't look pregnant, or she looked as if she had 2 sacks of potatoes hastily packed into her abdomen. The misshapen belly that peeked from beneath her filthy skirt was covered in purple bruises, and her face was gaunt beyond recognition. But despite her horrid appearance, she still managed to burst into another bout of joyous laughter when she saw me. She was laughing at me. The man with dreads tapped her on the shoulder and grumbled something in her ear, seized her laughter into mere malicious giggles on my account. "Time for birth," the man said as he rolled my wife past me. I tried to tell him that my wife wasn't meant to be due for another 3 weeks, but the man was deaf to my complaints. He simply grumbled the words again and wheeled my wife to the elevator. The ride to the village was undertaken in complete silence, intercut with manic bursts of laughter from my wife. She was deaf to all my pleas for an explanation, and wouldn't even look at me. The driver was, unsurprisingly, even less helpful. As I sat in the car, I wondered whether getting in was a good idea. My wife, at least according to Jana, wasn't capable of murder. Her friends, however, were a completely different sort. The closer we got to the village, the more I wondered how difficult it would be for me to disappear. When we arrived, there was no sheep grazing in the hills or pensioners sitting on their porches. The village was empty, save for the front yard of the house where my wife had her checkups. Out in the grass sat a roaring bonfire, and around it stood a dozen or so dreaded hippies. As the car stopped, I hastily messaged Jana. I told her what had happened and attached a location pin. She read my message, but she didn't respond. When I tried to enter the house along with my wife, the dreaded driver shoved me off and pointed towards the bonfire. I tried again to enter, but in response he shoved me off the stairs and sent me tumbling down to the mud. And my wife didn't seem to mind. She was giggling again. No one at the bonfire spoke a word. They all just stood in silence, stared into the flickering flames. Even when a new horrid wave of laughter rose from the house, they stayed still. As my wife's cackles reached a bone-chillingly unhealthy pitch, I tried once more to enter the house. The crowd wouldn't leave me. After a single step, they grasped my arms with tight grips and forced my face towards the fire. It was only once the laughter ceased that they let go of me. The crowd silently moved to the house, and I went with them. Without a word, we walked up the stairs and entered the room where my wife had had her checkup so many months prior. It was only then, in a crowd of unclean strangers, that I saw my wife and the thing she had birthed. The child was undoubtedly not of my blood. The child wasn't human.